Okay, well, I thought I paused my recording, but I guess I stopped it, so I've started again. So I'm going to ask those of you in group one, could you please use the chat to share what you found in terms of what is an API? Okay. Lindsay, that's a great definition. So it allows communication to happen where information is sent back and forth, right? Sort of like your waiter serves like the API between the customer request and the kitchen. All right, that's an excellent explanation. Anybody else in group one? Can you add to this? What else could we say about what an API is? Thanks, Lindsay. That's a great explanation. Can anybody else in group one add to this? I guess I would also say, here I'm going to modify this slightly, or between two servers and applications. There isn't necessarily a user here. Okay. So for example, years ago, I built an e-commerce site, and then we built an API. So when someone ordered something, we could automatically send out the order to whichever company manufactured the products on that order. It was all hands off. It was just a way of data flowing from one application into another one. We then built a separate API when my customers started selling their products on the shopping channel. So customers would see their products on TV, they'd call the shopping channel. Shopping channel would put those orders in their database, and then we built an API that they could automatically transfer those orders into our system for manufacture. Anybody else from group one want to add anything else about what an API is? Okay, I'm going to move on to group two, and your term is REST. So what is REST, other than something students don't typically get enough of? So if you're in group two, please use the chat. Tell us what you found out from your research. Sorry, I needed to scroll down. Sorry, I missed a few other items here. Thank you, Taylor. Yep. Allow the applications to communicate. Mikhail, yeah, it's like a translator. That's a good point, right? Because those two applications could be written on different platforms. One program could be written in Java, one could be written in C#, but the API lets them communicate. And Mike mentioned, right? It's a layer for receiving requests, sending responses, and it also defines a structure. What does the data look like? Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. So REST stands for Representational State Transfer. So it's an architecture pattern, much like MVC is a pattern, right? And when we use HTTP, we use common methods, and the ones we're typically going to use are get, post, put, and delete. Yeah, being the most common. And we're going to use these today. Okay, Barak will come back to URI. Okay, so we're going to build an API. We're going to use the REST architecture, which is the current standard for APIs. What about group 3? So Jeffrey mentioned put here. That's okay, no problem, Barack. What is the put method used for? So put replaces a resource. So if we're working with the database, what type of operation would the put method run if we're replacing an existing resource? When would we use it? You got it, Sierra. So used for updates in a REST API. So the other methods, so get is used for reading, post is used for creating, delete is self-explanatory. So if we want to update a record, the method we're going to use in an API, the HTTP method, is going to be put. Okay, now, and we'll use put today. So a URI, it's a resource. So there's two types, universal resource. Well, this stands for Uniform Resource Identifier. A URL is a universal resource locator. Right, so Rachan and Kevin, you've added some important notes here I'm going to add. So a URI, it's a specific resource, and a URL is a kind of URI. And it also includes the protocol. Is it HTTP? Is it FTP, for example? So all URLs are URIs, but not all URIs are URLs. Kevin, I'm going to add what you're saying here because you're right. Okay. So for example, yeah, a URI is like an ISBN number. This is not a URL. It's not a web address you could load in a browser, but it's still some kind of unique identifier. Okay. So a URL, it's a subset of a URI. Basically, a URL is a URI that uses a web protocol like HTTP or FTP. You know, but a URI could even be, let's say, for example, okay, well, let's think about it this way, right? You take a picture on your phone, and that picture is displayed in the gallery on your device. The path to that file on your device, that's a URI, right? It's a unique indicator, but it's not a web address. You can't load that photo in a browser. It doesn't use the HTTP protocol. So a URI simply means it's the location of a resource, where to find it. But that resource does not have to be a web resource. Taylor, does that help explain the distinction? Okay, good. And lastly, we had group 5, who your term was HTTP status code 400. So what is that? We're going to encounter that today. Sorry, Kevin, not necessarily. It has to have a path. So just an object in memory is not a URI. A URI suggests some permanent storage. So creating something in Java, it doesn't necessarily have a permanent location. It has a temporary location in memory when you create an array or a variable, but it's not permanent. So URI is typically permanent, something that's stored permanently. But it's an excellent question. So anybody in group 5, can you tell us what is HTTP status code 400? Okay, Sierra, yes, it's true. Can we be a little more specific? It's a specific type of error, though. So all the HTTP status codes that start with a 4 or 5, those are all errors, but they mean different things. Yeah, Kevin is right. Access denied. 404 is file not found. You got it. Okay. So what this means is bad request. The web server cannot interpret the request. Okay. If we actually take a look, it could be Barak. So it could be a syntax problem with the URL, or that required parameters are not provided. Okay. So if our request says we need like a customer object, and the user makes a call to that customer object, but to that API URL, but doesn't provide the object, it's going to be a bad request. So here are a list of HTTP status codes. So you can see the 200, we'll look at a number of these today. These are our success codes. Here's 400. So forbidden, not found, bad request, right? So the server can't process it because of some kind of client error. So Barak, yeah, it could be syntax, but it could be that the request is not providing what needs to be provided. So for example, maybe our request, we're trying to send an email from a method, but we don't provide a recipient email address. That's going to generate a bad request, okay? Because the server doesn't have what it needs to properly parse and process that request. So we'll look at this today. So this HTTP status is, I'm going to keep this open because there are some other useful statuses here. This is my favorite, status 418. I'm a teapot. This is what happens if you attempt to brew coffee with a teapot. You get status code 418. My kettle just died. Fortunately, my coffee maker, I've discovered, makes coffee and tea. So it should be returning something else. I'm a coffee pot. So we'll keep this open here because we'll come back to it. Okay. Thank you for those definitions. So now we want to start to, I've updated the stuff on Blackboard. Yes, so would I. Okay, a software download for you. I'm going to grab this tool. It's also going to be useful next semester in your JavaScript frameworks course. The tool is called Postman. So this is a tool that we can use for testing REST APIs. Okay, API is the go-between. REST is one, it is now the standard architecture for building APIs. So it's not the architecture of a website, it's specific for APIs. So the previous standard before REST was called SOAP, which stood for Simple Object Access Protocol. And REST APIs typically use JSON to exchange data. SOAP APIs typically used XML. Occasionally, you'll find some existing APIs that let you choose. Do you want to use SOAP with XML, or do you want to use REST with JSON? Actually, Canada Post, at least up until recently, they Yeah, they offered both. So if we go into their Canada Post API, so let's say you want to do something like look up a shipping rate or track a package with Canada Post. So their current version uses REST and JSON. The original version let's see. Oh, interesting. They actually, so it uses REST, but they're actually still using XML. They're not using JSON, which is interesting. And their original version used SOAP. So put is for update, URI is a universal resource indicator, and error codes, yes, when we call an API, because there's no front end, these HTTP status codes, they give us a clue as to what happened when we invoke an API. Was it successful or did it fail? And if so, why? So I want you to go to this link to get Postman, open it up. You do need to create a free account. So you've got to sign up. And then once you sign up, you can go to postman.com/downloads. Actually, you know what? You may not have to sign up. I'm sorry. Just go to the downloads and download the free Postman app here. I'll show you how Postman works. So I'm going to open it up. Close this up. So you should get a screen that looks something like this.
So you do need to create an account because when you open the application, your web in your computer, it says like create a Postman account to use it.
Okay, so you may need to. It's free. Yeah, maybe a couple people, once you've got it installed, let me know in the chat. I can hold on for a couple minutes. I won't move forward until people are sort of caught up. Pardon me. Okay. So we can use this to try out some APIs. And then we'll build our own, and then we'll use Postman to test it. So I'm going to go and load. I'll come back to Postman in a second. I'm going to put a link in the chat, another link in a minute. So this is a little fake API we can try. We're going to try this one first. It's called the JSON Placeholder API. It's a free-to-use fake online REST API for testing and prototyping. Sounds pretty good. So we can go here, and I'll show you what's here. So it has a series of what are known as API endpoints, right? So they're URLs, but remember, APIs have no front end. All they do is send and receive data. There's no user interface. So there are 6 different API endpoints / posts, comments, albums, photos, to-dos. And here are the routes. So we can run get methods at any one of these URLs. Get posts. This is going to give us a list of all the posts. Get posts 1 is going to give us the post with ID 1. Post 1 comments will give us all the child comments here. And this endpoint really does the same. So we can try this out. So I'm going to go to Postman. I'll click on the new button here, the plus button. And you'll notice I get a little drop down here with all the different HTTP methods. We're really interested in get, post, put, and delete. We don't really care about the other ones. So the default method is get. So here's the URL I'm going to put in. I'm going to go to the URL I just put in the chat, /posts. And I'm going to use Postman to call the API and inspect the response that comes back. So here's my full link. I'll press send. Move this up here. So Postman returns a 200 OK response, which is the standard response for successful requests. In a GET request, the response will contain an entity corresponding to the requested resource. So if I look here, you can click on pretty. I get this long list in JSON format of a whole bunch of posts. So if I want to get a single post, I could just add an ID parameter on to the end. So I've got an ID here that says 87. I'll run a new GET request. This time it only returns a single object, just one post here. So I've used GET both times. We're selecting data. So these API methods, they work kind of like our .NET controllers, how we have an index and a details method, right? They both query the database. Index fetches everything in a table, and details uses an ID parameter to fetch a single record. So the format of a REST API, it kind of follows that. So get with no parameters fetches a list, and get with an ID parameter fetches a single record. What if I put in an ID number like this? What kind of response do you expect us that we'll get back? Let's try it out and see. So, okay, so we've got bad request. Is the is the format of my request valid or invalid? It's valid, which suggests it's probably not going to be 400, right? So in this case, Mike is right. The requested resource could not be found. It may be available in the future. Now we could try this. This might give us, maybe this might give us a bad request. No, we still got not found in this case. Let's see. Interesting. I'm trying to see if I can generate a 400 this way. No. All right, well, so be it. Apparently so. Okay, so we can use Postman. It also has an albums API, right? So we can call the different methods in the API, and we can use Postman to test the response. So here's one API. Let's test out another one. Yes. Let's go here. Let's go to the Spotify API. Right? Now you're going to see a familiar pattern, right? We've got get methods with similar types of endpoints. If we want to get a list, we call version 1 v1/artists. If we call the same endpoint, but with an ID parameter on the end, that gives us a single artist. So I'm going to try using Postman to call the Spotify API. And here's the base URL, api.spotify.com/v1. There you go. Thank you for that. So I'm going to go in here, go into the Spotify documentation for a minute. So it says, here's the URL, right? api.spotify.com/v1/artist. So I'm going to use Postman and see if we can fetch a list of artists from Spotify. So I'm going to paste that in here. And in this case, we get a 401 unauthorized. So what happened? The response requires an authenticate header. So we need some sort of token. Spotify's API, it's not fully public. Right? And if we look at their documentation, which we're going to use later, it says in the header, it requires an authorization token. So you can't call any of the methods in Spotify without one of these tokens. But this describes, it describes here what a response from the Spotify API might look like. Now, we might even be able to get a testing token. Let's see. If not, we won't worry about it. Do they have a test token? So we'd have to register and get an access and a refresh token. Okay, probably too complicated for today. So this is how we would secure an API if we don't want it to be public, for example, beyond the scope of what we're going to do today. We'll just leave it. So the Tippy Code API, this one works, it's public. Spotify, not so much. Okay, well, let's try that one. Thanks, Lindsay. All right, let's try the Pokemon API. Right, so we can call, and Pokemon gives us a 200. It gives us a list. So the format of these REST APIs, it's generally similar. Okay. So it's 10 to 12. We've got things set up now. We kind of have an idea what a REST API is. We've got Postman installed. So let's take a 10-minute break here. We're going to come back at 12, and then we're going to use Visual Studio to build a couple of API controllers ourselves, and then we can test them out in Postman. And then we can use Swagger to generate a simple API documentation, some sample documentation like Spotify does. Because it's not good enough to just build your API. You've got to document it so developers that are going to interface with it, they know how to use it. What are the endpoints? What are the methods? Okay, cool. Thanks, Mike. We'll take a look at that. Yep, there are lots of them. There are lots of tools. There's even extensions that you can use that are built right into the browser. You can add a browser extension instead. So I'll have a look at that. Not familiar with Hopscotch, but yeah, Postman's certainly not the only one. Thanks for sharing. Yep, really. So it does the same thing in your browser. That's cool. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break here and we will come back 12:02 and we'll start building our own APIs.